topics and opinions expressed in the following show are solely those of the hosts and their guests and not those of W4CY Radio, its employees, or affiliates. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our web. No liability, explicit or implied, shall be extended to W4CY Radio or its employees or affiliates. Any questions or comments should be directed to those show hosts. Thank you for choosing W4CY Radio.
What's working on purpose anyway? Each week, we ponder the answer to this question. People ache for meaning and purpose at work, to contribute their talents passionately and know their lives really matter. They crave being part of an organization that inspires them and helps them grow into realizing their highest potential. Business can be such a force for good in the world, elevating humanity. In our program, we provide guidance and inspiration to help usher in this world we all want, working on purpose. Now, here's your host, Dr. Elise Cortez.
Welcome back to the Working on Purpose program. Thanks for tuning in again this week. Great to have you. I'm your host, Dr. Elise Cortez, joining you live from Dallas, which is home base for me. If you don't know me yet, I'm a management consultant specializing in meaning and purpose, organizational logotherapist, inspirational speaker, social scientist, and author. My team and I help companies to discover and articulate their purpose to thread it through culture and operations. We work with forward-thinking or forward-reaching organizations to develop inspirational leaders who create cultures where people actually want to come to work and do their best. And we provide programs that enable individual team members and leaders to discover and unleash their passion and purpose at work to catalyze fulfillment, engagement, and productivity. You can learn more about us and how we can work together at elisecortez.com. One other piece of news, my new book is about to come out. It's called The Great Revitalization, How Activating Meaning and Purpose Can Radically Enliven Your Business. It's due out March 2023. You can pre-order your copy on bookshop.org or barnesandnoble.com. With us today is Professor Salim Ali. He's a Pakistani-American-Australian academic who is the Blue and Gold Distinguished Professor of Energy and the Environment at the University of Delaware. He's also a member of the United Nations International Resource Panel. He joined us today from Newark, Delaware. Professor Ali, welcome to Working on Purpose.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cortez.
It's amazing to have you. As I said to you before we got on air, having read your book, I now know that I have met a beautiful mind.
Very kind of you.
Infinite, beautiful mind. Your book is really amazingly quite ambitious. So I have a few questions just about that, since I'm also an author too. What in the world possessed you to write such a big, beautiful, profound book?
Well, the book's origins go back some 20 years, actually, when I was a PhD student at MIT. And I had a chance encounter with a great thinker, evolutionary biologist named Stephen Jay Gould, whom some of your listeners may know. He was a great popularizer of science. And at the time, I was trying to figure out, how does one communicate complex foundational knowledge to the broad public? And I was involved in a project called Beyond the Ivory Tower, which is that, I was trying to look at academics who have gone beyond their usual academic writing, and they've tried to communicate to the larger public. So I've always wanted to write a book for a broader audience, but the challenge was, what topic do I choose, and something that hasn't already been done, because we are living in an information glut with so much coming out in terms of writing. Then about 5 years ago, I decided to choose a topic where I would use the lens of order, because order is a topic that keeps getting brought up time and again in different circles. Politicians bring it up as the new world order. And as a scientist, I was always a bit unsettled when people say new world order. It sounds like very grand, but it's not often very meaningful. And so then I decided, okay, this is going to be the book where I connect natural systems and natural order with social and political order. And I'm very fortunate that I've been trained in both the natural sciences and the social sciences. My first degree was in chemistry, and then I did my higher studies further in environmental studies and environmental planning. So that's how the book came about. And it is ambitious in that sense, but it's meant to provide a more holistic approach. And I think for the work you do in terms of leadership development and also used from a psychological perspective. I think it's really important for us to make those connections. And leaders these days are often too reductionist. They're too focused on a few things, and they miss the bigger picture. Kind of, they miss the forest for the trees. So that's the other goal of the book.
Wonderful. Well, the reason I was enticed to have you on, Professor Ali, twofold. One is I'm really intrigued with however we humans can learn from the natural order, from nature. I think there's so much for us to learn and stop being so silly about trying to do it our way. And then the second reason that I was interested in is I'm interested in sustainability and in environmentalism. And in fact, I noticed that you and I have a similar experience in that you, the 1992 Rio Earth Summit was a great impact on you. I was living in Rio de Janeiro at the time. I attended that summit. I saw leaders from the 170 countries from around come together and talk about the environment and climate and problems. And I was just blown away by that. So those were the two reasons that I really wanted to share you with my listenership based on what we've covered so far. So reactions to that before I ask you the next question?
Yes, no, absolutely. The Earth Summit was a monumental event because it brought together world leaders to talk about nature. There had been previous Earth Summits. In 1972 in Stockholm was the world's first conference on the human environment. But it was not attended by the full sort of scale of leadership that the Rio Summit involved, where you had so many heads of state coming to the table for the first time. So absolutely, the Earth Summit was a game changer, also because 3 major international environmental treaties were signed there: the Climate Change Convention, the Biodiversity Convention, and the Convention on desertification, to combat desertification. So that's where our kind of global attempt to deal with climate change began. And so, yes, absolutely game-changing time.
Wow. Thank you for filling in more details for me. It's even more yummy now that I hear that. Now, back to your book. One of the things I always like to be able to ask authors is, what do you hope readers will get from reading your book? What do you hope happens in their hearts and minds?
Yes. So the audience for the book is the general public. But I would want to also hope that the book has the academic credentials that students in academia and even in high school would find it useful as a kind of foundational learning around natural systems. And what the book is trying to do is what I would call moving the needle from environmental awareness to environmental literacy. I think everyone is environmentally aware these days. You know, if you talk to the public, they know about climate change. They're concerned about the cleaning the rivers and plastic pollution and so on. But what are some of the underlying foundational learning elements, why we should be concerned? Often that gets missed. And so that's one of the goals of the book. And I try to do that through this lens of understanding order. And I do it also with some personal anecdotes to make it accessible. But I did go with the university press as a publisher because I wanted to make sure that the book was peer reviewed and it would have the legitimacy with academia. Now, one of the challenges we have is a lot of the trade books, which are often much easier to sell because the publishers have a very wide network, they often are not peer reviewed. And so for me, that was really important to have the credibility.
Well, that is beautiful. Now, I'm going to call attention to 2 things pertinent to your book before we get more into the content. On the front cover, you have an endorsement, and this is from Roald Hoffman, a Nobel laureate in chemistry, who says, "I learned something nearly on every page." And boy, if that is an understatement, I don't know what is. Let's just say
so generous of him. He's an amazing man. You know, Roald Hoffman is one of the most humble people I've met who've reached those, Olympian heights of academia. And he's also a Holocaust survivor. I mean, his family actually, given the current context of Ukraine, when during World War II, he was a child, and he and his mother were living in Ukraine when there was the invasion, and they had to hide in an attic of a house for a year. I mean, he's a remarkable person, and to now have reached where he did.
Oh, that's beautiful. Really beautiful. I like the company that you keep. The other thing that we must talk about and share with our listeners is that you're donating all of the proceeds of this book to environmental education programs around the world. That is remarkable.
Yes,
So really, as you said before, it really is a labor of love.
that's right. Yes, I have written, this is my fourth sole authored book, and I feel that I have a comfortable life. Being a tenured professor is a privilege in academia. And while I'm no tycoon by any means, I feel as though that whatever I can do from especially the writing in this kind of spirit, and I've dedicated the book to my students also, it should go back to the community, and especially for environmental education programs in developing countries. So that's going to be the thrust of my charity in there.
It's beautiful. It's just beautiful. So let's now get into the content a little bit here. The first thing I wanted to talk about, which has been intriguing for me for quite some time, is the notion of the circular economy. Would you
Mhm.
talk to us a little bit about what does that mean in particular? And then, of course, what does that mean for the world of business today, or the opportunities, I should say?
Yes. So, natural systems tend to be circular in most of their operations. So we have cycles of elements that flow through nature. We talk about the carbon cycle, we talk about the nitrogen cycle. And then living beings also tend to have cyclical flows. We eat, we have waste, the waste gets digested by different kinds of other natural processes, and then we're able to get nutrients back and so on. So there's circularity in nature.
Mhm.
And if we recognize that ultimately the economy is going to be dependent on natural systems, then we should also try to be emulating natural systems in their circularity. But the economy currently is generally linear because we often do not think about wastes in the same way as we would think about other products. And so the paradigm of the circular economy is meant to basically imitate nature in terms of also having economic systems which are circular. So you create incentives whereby people will take wastes and bring them back into functional use. So you actually try to do away with the notion of waste altogether. And
Mm.
that's also true of energy, that you try to have the most efficient circulation of energy in the same way, materials and energy flows circulating in that sense. Now, I try to, again, in this book, go a little bit deeper than just the buzzword, because if you just do a Google search on circular economy, you'll find like tons of PDF documents, fancy charts and all. But going a little deeper, you might want to say, well, but how might the circular economy go wrong? And it can go wrong. So for example, if you just focus on circularity from an efficiency perspective and you say, well, we're getting more efficient, you might still miss the total impact of what you are doing. So you could have a circular economy which is still having a big impact because you're consuming far more resources.
Mm.
And so I also talk about some of those pitfalls of a circular economy. It's also similar with efficiency. Efficiency is a good thing, but efficiency, if you don't keep track of your total consumption, it can still be a problem. And like, for example, with hybrid cars or electric cars, people feel good about having them, but often because they feel good, they end up driving more. So if they end up driving more, you're having, an aggregate impact is actually ending up being worse. So that kind of dynamic.
Interesting. I also, speaking of electric cars, I read somewhere, and it'd be great if you can comment really quick since you just brought this up. I understand the battery piece that can be actually problematic. What that does in terms of, I don't know, is that the waste piece is what it takes to actually recharge the battery? What's the
Well,
problem with
with
the
the
battery?
batteries, the current concern is that we need a lot of metals to manufacture the batteries.
Okay.
And we do not have those metals readily available, especially lithium. And so we will need a lot of mining to be able to have the volume of batteries for this low carbon transition. And eventually we can recycle the batteries. But until we are able to get enough stock, we will have to mine metal. So that's the concern. Currently,
Okay.
even with the Inflation Reduction Act, they've put in uh, clauses to try and encourage extraction of metals for batteries. And then the other concern is that a lot of those metals currently are in China because we do not have the mines, nor do we have the processing facilities. And because, unfortunately, the relations between the US and China and other countries have deteriorated, there's a security concern around that.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that was extremely useful for me, Professor Ali. Thank you for that. I think at this time, let's go ahead and grab our first break before we get into the actual content of from your book. I'm Dr. Elise Cortez. We've been on the air with Professor Salim Ali, who is a Pakistani American Australian academic who is the Blue and Gold Distinguished Professor of Energy and the Environment at the University of Delaware. We've been talking a bit about why he wrote this book, what he hopes to accomplish, and some things we've already learned about how we can apply what he can teach us. After the break, we're going to get into some of his lessons that he details for us in the book. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Dr. Elise Cortez is a management consultant specializing in meaning and purpose, an inspirational speaker and author. She helps companies visioneer for greater purpose among stakeholders and develop purpose-inspired leadership and meaning-infused cultures that elevate fulfillment, performance, and commitment within the workforce. To learn more or to invite Elise to speak to your organization, please visit her at elisecortez.com. Let's talk about how to get your employees working on purpose. This is Working on Purpose with Dr. Elise Cortez. To reach our program today or to open a conversation with Elise, send an email to Elise, A-L-I-S-E, at elisecortez.com. Now, back to Working on Purpose.
Thanks for staying with us. Before we get back into the program, I'd like to invite you to check out a book that I put out in November of 2020. It's called Purpose Ignited. And I really wrote it to awaken readers to their passion and purpose and turn them into inspirational leaders who create workplaces where people actually want to come to work and do their best. And that is the basis of my leadership program. So I hope you'll check it out. If you're just joining the program today, my guest is Professor Salim Ali. He's the author of Earthly Order, How Natural Laws Define Human Life. I'm your host, Dr. Elise Cortez. So I want to get into what you wrote here in the back of the book here about lessons learned here. So the first one is really interesting. And of course, as you know, through the lens of we're about work and leadership, et cetera. So you say lesson one is patterns raise useful questions, but not always useful answers. So how can we relate that to the world of work and leadership and learn from it?
Yes. So for work and leadership, one of the real take-home lessons on this issue is that patterns can lead to prejudice. Now that may seem provocative, but if you think about how do stereotypes evolve because we look at a pattern and we see that people are behaving in a certain way, and then we make assumptions about their behavior more generally. So it is the pattern which takes us in that direction, whereby we can create a stereotype and then we create prejudice. So when I say patterns raise useful questions, but not always useful answers, that's the caution I'm hinting at, is that the human brain is wired to look for patterns. That's how we are able to synthesize information. And we've got so many signals being sent at us that the brain tries to see what patterns are there. But those patterns then can lead to these kinds of prejudicial outcomes as well if we are not careful. So that would be one real lesson for the leadership community around patterns.
And that's certainly, especially the unconscious bias piece you were talking about. We have certainly covered that on this program as well, when that comes to looking at recruiting a talent, looking for more of a diverse workforce, and who gets promoted and who gets on the newest, coolest assignments kind of thing. So that's very useful insight for us, Professor. Thank you for sharing that. Anything else come to your mind with regard to that?
Other, just to bring a little bit of a nuance to that, is that there is always some kernel of truth in stereotypes. And so that's the temptation. And there's a wonderful TED talk by a Nigerian writer, Chimamanda Adichie, where she talks about the danger of a single story. And there's this quotation she has in there that the problem with stereotypes is not that they are wrong, but that they are incomplete. And that's a key lesson. So you recognize that there may be something there with the pattern, but it's incomplete to draw a conclusion from it. And that's where we need to be careful.
One of the things I got from reading your book is the tendency that it seems that we humans have to draw comfort from these patterns. We feel like, oh, look, there's a pattern. We've got this. Oh, okay, I can relax now. And I appreciate that how you draw attention not to rest on that.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so lesson 2 is natural order is ultimate, but humanistic order is proximate. What does that mean?
Yes. So, ultimately we are confined by the laws of nature, right? In terms of how the universe works, the laws of physics and chemistry, they define the ways in which we have our own daily functional lives, how we drive a car, how we go to work, etc. But ultimately, that ultimate dependence on natural order doesn't necessarily mean that on our day-to-day lives we are going to advert to it. So that's what I mean by humanistic order is proximate. And so what we need to then think about is what scale of analysis do we need for different kinds of problems. There could be some kinds of problems where we are fine with just focusing on proximate forms of order, and we do not necessarily need to go all the way to the full quantum mechanics of the operation. And then there may be others where we do need to have that full understanding. So that's going to be the key challenge for politicians, and especially people who are working in leadership too, more generally in business leadership too, is where do we focus on the proximate humanistic order? So if you're in an HR organization, if you're managing people, you don't need to go to the quantum mechanics of the operation to understand that. What you need is humanistic proximate order. But if you are looking at the corporation's overall impact on society, so if you have someone who is in the CEO role, they do need to look at the much larger aspects of natural order and how they connect to these elements. And that's how companies evolve. And I should mention, I used to work in industry. I'm not just an armchair academic. I worked in General Electric for 2 years. And this was during the Jack Welch era, the legendary CEO. And this was between my master's and my PhD. And then at that time, I got an appreciation for how companies deal with these scales of analysis, because GE at the time was a very diversified company. They were selling everything from aircraft engines to mortgages, because they had big GE capital operation. But one of the great visions of the late Jack Welch was to think as a system for the company. Now, one of his deficiencies, though, was that he defined that system just as the economic system. So he wanted a very diversified company when it came to having these different kinds of businesses. Right. He didn't want it to just be the Thomas Edison company that made light bulbs and power systems, which was the origin of the company. But he looked at all these products. But he was not very keen on sustainability from a planetary perspective. So, for example, GE at the time didn't get into the wind power business because they thought, oh, it's too far out there. So I think, that's the thing, is where we need to be able to figure out that decision making of the proximate and the ultimate. And I think that's what we should strive for, especially in industry.
Mm-hmm. I have a perfect example to share at this point. You've just queued it up for me. And this is another reason why I wanted to have you on the show, because this was awakened by this. So there is a documentary out there called Beyond Zero, and it was produced by Nathan Havey. It showcases the story of how Ray Anderson took his Dow Tower carpet company called Interface from one that he proudly said, that our carpet is indestructible, which means it'll never biodegrade, to, oh my gosh, we're plummeting the earth with this stuff. And what I appreciate about their story and what's showcased there in that documentary is that he literally, if you will, got religion at some point and said, gosh, I want to do something good for the planet, not bad for the planet. So he and his team began to really orient their decision-making about, so for example, if we want different colored carpets, how does the forest handle color? Let's go study what the forest says about color. And so they adapted some of their color pieces from what they learned from the forest. How does nature handle waste? Right. So they went and studied that, which is again another reason I wanted to have you on, because if my thinking is if we can learn from the magnificent teacher of nature and somehow pattern our operations, our structures from her, it seems to me the world will be a much better place. And so I appreciate both your example and the one that I learned in Beyond Zero. It sounds like you've seen that documentary, know of it.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, Ray Anderson's a legend in the sustainability business arena, and absolutely that kind of awakening is so important. More and more business leaders should have the courage when many of them are awoken, but they don't want to come forward because they have comfortable lives and they don't want to move away from them. So I think to have that awakening and then to bring it forward, I think is really commendable.
Well, and I do too. And of course, I stand to help inspire and encourage that kind of activity, right? That's a big part of what I'm doing in the world is cheering you on. As you said before, I'm on the board of Conscious Capitalism. That's way beyond conscious capitalism, of course. But so a great, great lesson that I certainly stand to hope. And I hope that this program also serves as an invitation, as an educational outlet for people to recognize, oh, I could do that with my company. I could do that with my leadership. That's exactly what I want this to stand for. And having guests like you help me do that. So thank you, Professor. So lesson 3, you say transitions in and out of order are not always reversible in space or time. Oh my,
Yes,
sounds
yeah.
scary.
Yeah, this is the thing is that in many economic systems, we often say, well, we'll make a mistake and then we'll be able to correct it. And certainly within the management community, there is this sense that you can learn from failure. And certainly you can, at the humanistic side. But there are certain kinds of failures which can be irreversible. And certainly natural systems are like that too. So you have reversible reactions in chemistry, but you have also irreversible reactions. And as you go from chemistry to biology, the irreversibility aspect becomes even more consequential. So what would be the most irreversible reaction in living systems? Well, death, right? We still haven't figured out a way to reverse death, even though we are able to do a lot of mechanistic changes. And that's one of the aspects of the book where it's important to differentiate between complicated and complex. Complicated things are those which have parts that you can fix. They may still have a lot of parts, like an aircraft. An aircraft is complicated, but it's not complex because you can diagnose a problem and you can fix it. A complex system has irreversibility in many of its outcomes, and you are not able to just go in and tweak something and bring it back. And that's one of the reasons when despite all the advances in medicine, we aren't able to, once you have the flatlining, you can't bring the person back. You could go in and try to do everything right with the valve and the heart, clear up the cholesterol and the arteries, but it's just, that's it. And that there's a reason for that. And the book talks about the natural science reasons for those kinds of irreversible aspects of biotic system reactions. Aging is different. Aging, you can find ways of reversing to some degree. And there's actually, the book has a little section which talks about aging and how that's different. So that's kind of what I'm getting at with this aspect of irreversibility, and that we need to recognize that certain things are going to be reversible.
That I have to serve this question up, given what you just said then about irreversibility. What is your perspective? And you probably wrote about this in the book, and I may have missed it, on climate change. Have we gone past the point of no return?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the evidence is pretty clear now that in certain areas we have reached a tipping point, and the next lesson we'll talk about is on tipping points. But that the tipping point is a sense of an irreversible reaction where, in order to, if you really wanted to reverse it, you need a lot of energy also to bring it back. And with reference to climate change, I think we are at a point where if we just focus on mitigation, which is to reduce emissions, I think we will not be able to really make the impact that is needed to curtail the damage that has been done. And so we have to think about adaptation. Now, I am a hopeful person, and in the book I talk about the importance of technology in being able to adapt. And that goes to another lesson, the last lesson in terms of the role of technology we'll talk about in a minute.
Fascinating. So adaptability. Okay, so you want to hit that on that, because I definitely want to hear beyond just being able to curtail emissions. What can we do? So let's go ahead and save that for the next bit here, the next segment. We'll go ahead and grab our last break. I'm Elise Cortez. We've been on the air with Professor Salim Ali talking about his book, Earthly Order: How Natural Laws Define Human Life. I'm your host, Dr. Elise Cortez. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Dr. Elise Cortez is a management consultant specializing in meaning and purpose, an inspirational speaker and author. She helps companies visioneer for greater purpose among stakeholders and develop purpose-inspired leadership and meaning-infused cultures that elevate fulfillment, performance, and commitment within the workforce. To learn more or to invite Elise to speak to your organization, please visit her at elisecortez.com. Let's talk about how to get your employees working on purpose. This is Working on Purpose with Dr. Elise Cortez. To reach our program today or to open a conversation with Elise, send an email to Elise, A-L-I-S-E, at elisecortez.com. Now, back to Working on Purpose.
Thanks for staying with us, and welcome back to Working on Purpose. One other piece of news I do want to share with you is last August of 21, I was able to get out a book called Passionately Striving and Why. What that is, it's a collection of 25 stories from women around the world, from Australia to Zambia, who share their very intimate details of how they discovered their purpose and are now serving from it. So it's meant to educate and inspire you. So I hope you'll pick one up for yourselves. If you've just joined the program today, my guest is Professor Salim Ali. He's the author of Earthly Order: How Natural Laws Define Human Life. He is also the professor at, he's a Pakistani American Australian academic who is the Blue and Gold Distinguished Professor of Energy and the Environment at the University of Delaware, an incredibly accomplished human being. So we get to learn from him today. So the last lesson, now there's two more. Lesson number 4 is tipping point can lead to accelerated order or disorder, which is what you were talking about just before we left for the air. So take us home with that.
Yes, so I mean, the people are generally familiar with the notion of tipping points. They were popularized by Malcolm Gladwell, and
Yes.
The sense that there's a certain kind of a fulcrum, basically, where you go past the hill and the ball rolls down, and then you can't get the ball back up without having a lot of energy. And certainly, tipping points are there in natural systems as well. So that's part of the lessons I draw from the discussion of natural order, is that tipping points do happen in the same way in nature, and then they are seen in social systems similarly as well. But what is interesting is not just that they are accelerated in a positive way, but also in a negative way, and both sides. And that's what this lesson is getting at, is we can have accelerated tipping points towards order or disorder. So if you can have a tipping point lead to something really bad, and you can also have a tipping point very quickly accelerate towards something very positive. I mean, for example, in the origin of life research, if people go back to like how did life originate biochemically, it was due to a tipping point that was reached in terms of certain biochemical reactions that actually led to the creation of living cells, right? So you can have that as an acceleration of a tipping point that leads to order, because life itself is the ultimate kind of form of order, right? You've taken complex molecules and made a system which is self-functioning and self-sustaining. So that's the real lesson here, is that, Malcolm Gladwell talks a lot about the negative tipping points. And here I talk also about the positive tipping points in both accelerated order and disorder.
So take us back now to climate change. So you had said before the break that we need something beyond just controlling our emissions and we need adaptability. So what does that mean in terms of tipping points?
Yes, so in the case of climate change, I think we have reached a certain tipping point in terms of the way the meteorological system of the planet functions and how heat is transferred and ocean currents work and so on. And that once you reach a certain tipping point, these systems then lose their usual balance of operation. And the classic one is, we talk about the jet stream. We talk about these different kinds of currents that are operating. And so basically, once we reach that, then we have to recognize that we can't change it anymore. We can try and try, but it's going to be too much energy required to make the changes we need potentially. And so then we have to adapt. And the United Nations is recognizing that. And one of my roles, I serve on the United Nations International Resource Panel, where we look at the data on global change of resource usage, and we try to inform member states of the UN around resource usage. So now the UN generally has recognized that we can't just mitigate emissions and solve our challenge. We will have to invest in adaptation. Historically, 90% of investment has gone into climate mitigation. By that, I mean reducing carbon emissions, putting different kinds of carbon reduction technologies, transitioning to wind power, solar power, so on. So that's been 90% of the finance has gone towards that. Only 10% went into adaptation until like last year when the UN has said, look, we really need to start focusing on adaptation because we've reached a tipping point to a large degree where we're not going to be able to solve the problem just by mitigation. So that's how it relates to climate change.
Beautifully explained. Thank you, Professor Ali. That's just beautiful. I really feel like I'm talking to a really interesting encyclopedia. All right. So lesson 5 then. This is provocative. Earthly order can be both discovered and invented.
Yes, yep. So this is where the technology part comes in. When people talk about natural laws, like the laws of nature, we talk about in science. There's this sense of like we're discovering some kind of equation. We're discovering the way the universe works. And there is some truth to that, absolutely, that we have certain constraints of gravity. We have Einstein's theory of relativity, which has been empirically shown to be accurate in most circumstances. And that's there. Those are the constraints we have. But that's the order we are discovering, right? But we can also invent order. As human beings, we have the ability to engineer order in a way to make our lives more functional and to improve our well-being. And we shouldn't shy away from that. So I'm not some kind of unrealistic kind of tree hugger in that sense, to put it in more colloquial terms, where I would say, look, we just go to some kind of primordial sense of order in nature. We can invent order in nature in certain cases, and that can be just fine. It can work. I mean, one of the very interesting examples of that is, with the shipwrecks. Shipwrecks become a great environments for fish and coral reefs sometimes. And, human beings have engineered that kind of a system, but in this case, by accident. But that can happen. We have the ability also to invent order which can favor nature, right? And I think that is an important lesson, which sometimes our friends in the environmental community are too resistant to embrace, because we do need to, and they tend to go towards this kind of very atavistic notion of like, there was a time, there was the Garden of Eden and that kind of thing. And I think we need to, that's not very helpful, because we are where we are and we have to figure out a way forward in terms of inventing an order which is going to be more sustainable.
I don't know what you just said that made me think of this, but have you by chance seen the documentary My Octopus Teacher?
No, I've been wanting to, but because it got these Oscars and all this, and I haven't seen it, but I've heard about it. I know the theme. Yes.
For me, Professor Ali, I've seen it exactly 11 times. And I've
Wow.
had the associate producer on the radio show, Swati Thiagajaran, who is Craig Foster, the documentary speaker on the show, talking about that in her work. And what I love about it, the reason I keep going back to it, and it's relative to this conversation, is in my mind, his sharing of his experience of going underwater and befriending this octopus and really learning from her, revering her as a beautiful, creature, but also really recognizing, and he's really rendering this notion of being part of something, not observing it, not conquering it, being part of nature, and how you can learn from its systems and its order. And I just think it's incredibly compelling. I would love to hear what you have to say about it if you ever do watch it, because I just think it's magnificent and speaks beautifully to this conversation we're having.
Yes, no, I am familiar with the theme, and I think it's that sense of humility that we are showing through a film like that. Or there have also been other great fictional works which have shown the same kind of dynamic around where human beings are with reference to the larger universe, and even like within science fiction and Star Trek, some of the episodes which go into that, figuring out what are those constraints that we have to operate under. And that's absolutely pivotal for moving forward. The only caution I would have is that sometimes people can use that kind of narrative to move away from science itself, and then they go into this kind of a very feel good kind of approach, which is not often. So I mean, the octopus is clearly, for example, got a tremendous amount of experience, if one can call it in that sense, of living in the ocean and so on. But the octopus is not going to have the same level of intellect that human beings have in certain other ways. And so as long as we keep that balance, I think we're fine, and and approach it with humility.
I think you would find that he does render it that way. He does, and he does actually thread in quite a bit of science about her and what he learns about the whole octopus genus as well. So it's kind of an interesting mix. Okay, so something you said in your book that I thought was really, really, really fascinating, we have to talk about this, is you said something about coda chromatic order, and I'm interested in how that relates to engaging hearts and minds of people inside organizations. What's coda chromatic order?
Yeah.
What is it first?
Yeah. So, the coda is basically like the bow you tie at the end of the book, usually, it's kind of a literary term. So when I use the term chromatic order, and I do use a little bit of this fancy language occasionally in the book. I wrote this book as part of a Rockefeller Foundation Writers Fellowship in Bellagio, Italy, and we worked with other writers, and so part of it is using language in innovative ways. And I know some readers think that may seem pretentious, but I have tried to do it in a way where hopefully it's just giving a bit more depth to what we're talking about. So the term chromatic comes from color, right? And I start the book with the metaphor of a kaleidoscope.
Yes.
Where that kaleidoscope is a way in which order and disorder interact with each other, right? And as a child growing up in Pakistan, I was fascinated by kaleidoscopes, because a kaleidoscope, if you look at it from the point of view of just the substances it's made of, it's got completely disordered things in there. In Pakistan, the kaleidoscopes were made of like glass bangles, which were crushed and put in this little tube with mirrors in it. And clearly, each fragment of glass is disordered, right? It's got just random shapes. But you put it in a mirrored hexagon tube, and it creates order. When you look through the little peephole, you see these amazing patterns, right? So the chromatic order is going back like full circle to where I started the book with the kaleidoscope metaphor, and saying ultimately we have to think about color and order, and what's real and what is an illusion in some ways. Now, color itself is an interesting feature. Color itself has no physical reality. When we say something is blue or green, it's just that the circuitry in our eyes is giving certain brain signals, which tells the brain, oh, this is this color, because certain wavelengths of light are falling on it. But there isn't something you can say, this is physically a green thing, like a molecule is green, It's all about the light and the imaging. And so order is being created in terms of color through light. And so the chromatic order is giving you that sense of like, this is how we need to think about order. There are lots of things which may not have physical reality, but they have immense importance when it comes to the way in which we process information. And that's important moving forward as well. So that's where the chromatic order comes from.
Okay. I don't know why I somehow thought about how we might be able to relate that or use that as some kind of way to inform how we engage the hearts and minds of people inside companies. Can you see that connection?
Yes, I think, like with companies, many times if you're thinking about marketing, with marketing, you have to think about like, what is it that is going to resonate with the person's emotions and so on. And so you create you invent certain kinds of order that is going to be captivating to that individual. But always remember that you are marketing and you are in many cases exaggerating. In many cases, you are giving signals which may not necessarily have the same level of accuracy. And I think that as long as you know those guardrails, then you end up with a much better outcome in terms of reputation, rather than you trying to do something which is then completely, misleading to the customer. So that's another way of relating it to kind of the business audience. Always keeping your eye on the ball, recognizing there's messaging, and you're looking at the colors. They are being used by the way in which the mind processes the information. But many times that in itself is an illusion. And then people are going to find out. Nowadays, we have so many other signals. That's why we have people are giving, reviews. They're giving all these other things. So that creates additional filters for people to make sense.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. I think it's fascinating, by the way, that you started your life really focused and riveted on kaleidoscopes. That told me so much. When you opened the book with that, I'm like, ooh, I know this is going to be a brilliant mind if you're fascinated with that at such a young age. So I caught that beautiful detail. So we've come to the end already. This goes by so fast. This show is listened to by people around the world who care about creating workplaces where people actually want to come to work and do their best. We create those inspirational leaders that lead them to their greatness, and we do business that betters the world. What would you like to leave people with today?
Well, I would like to urge your audience to consider the fact that humanity has been around. If you look at it from the time scale, we've been around on this planet for a very small fraction of the age of the planet, and even smaller fraction of the age of the universe. And what this book, when I talk about earthly order, I'm trying to make us understand our place in the universe in that context, and what are the constraints under which we are operating. I think that can be a very enriching experience for one personally. If you think in those terms, it also will give you, I think, a lot of composure, because you kind of see like, this is what I can control and this is what I cannot control. And I think that's the real strength of a leader, is recognizing what you can control and what you can invent in terms of order, and what you cannot, and what you have to discover in nature in terms of order.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful way to finish, Professor Ali. I'm so happy to have crossed paths with you and read your book. You have enriched my life, and I hope that you are doing the same thing for our listeners and viewers across the globe. Thank you for being on Working on Purpose.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cortez.
If you want to learn more about Professor Ali, his latest book, or check out his amazing work he does many, many different things. You can start by visiting his personal website. It's salimali.net. Let me spell that for you. It's SALEEMALI.net. Last week, if you missed the live show, you can always catch it via recorded podcast. We were on with Jeff Rabeth of Thought Ensemble, talking about what some innovative companies are doing today to attract, develop, and retain talent during this great resignation time. Next week, we'll be on the air with Wendy Smith, the co-author of Both and Thinking, Embracing Creative Tensions to Solve Your Toughest Problems. See you there. Remember that work is an integral and important part of our lives. It can be one of the best adventures and means of realizing our potential and making the impact we crave. So let's work on purpose.
We hope you've enjoyed this week's program. Be sure to tune into Working on Purpose, featuring your host, Dr. Elise Cortez, each week on W4CY. Together, we'll create a world where business operates conscientiously, leadership inspires impassioned performance, and employees are fulfilled in work that provides the meaning and purpose they crave. See you there. Let's work on purpose.